I was actually born in Hawthorne in 1927. Laura Osborne now, and my grandparents and my mother bought property here in Lawndale in 1908 after coming from New York and first living in Compton for a couple of years. We bought property on Prairie Avenue, and eventually the house that Jim Osborne still lives in was started to be built. And I lived all my life in Lawndale. I went to Lawndale Central School from kindergarten through 8th grade, graduated from there and went to Lusinger High School for 4 years, graduated in 1945. Went there during World War II, which was interesting. We used to have blackouts, air raid drills. Most of the men teachers were drafted, even some of the boys, as soon as they got to be 16, would go into service. It was a difficult time. The church I went to was a Lawndale Congregational Church on Mansell, and it was called Market Street at that point in time. And I used to walk most of the time to school and to church. And I can vaguely remember the streetcar line that came through. I remember Mr. Bessam, the postmaster, the high-wheeled cart that he took the mail from the post office on Market Street over to the station at Hawthorne Boulevard. And the tracks ran down the middle of Hawthorne Boulevard where there's parking now. And it went between Redondo Beach and downtown Los Angeles. And it was taken out when I was either in the 2nd or 3rd grade. And my grandfather had a dairy, one of the first dairies here, and my grandmother raised chickens and sold eggs. And my mother was the first librarian. She actually started the library as a volunteer, wasn't paid for the first year. And later she became the postmaster and did that for several years. My father was Albert Thomas, and he and his brother had a garage and service station at the corner of Rosecrans and Hawthorne Boulevard. I think that's where my mother met my father, was at that station. She had a early touring car called a Dort. I don't recall that. They were married in 1926 and went and lived in Glendale for less than a year after they were first married, and then came back and lived in Lawndale from then on. And let's see, what else can I think that's about it for now.
Some old stores?
Oh yeah, the stores. I can remember Shoes Market, which is actually called the Lawndale Market in Jim's book, but we always called it Shoes Market. And across the street was Jow's, which was a Japanese-run market. And the post office was in an old building originally on what was then Market Street, and then moved to a stucco building that Bessams owned, and it was in there. But my earliest remembrance of it was when it was at the corner of Hawthorne Boulevard and Market Street then, in the building that had been a drugstore. And it's now, I think, a furniture store. The building is still there. And across the street, where the animal hospital is now, was a bank. And that actually closed when the stock market crash hit in 1929 that caused the Great Depression. I can remember my grandparents and parents lost money in that bank closure. Let's see.
All the fields you guys used to walk through, the trails?
Oh yes, it was very rural then. Actually, nothing much was east of Prairie. It was all Japanese vegetable farms when I was growing up. Prior to that, the Bodger Company had a seed farm and raised sweet peas, primarily for seed. And the Japanese raise sweet peas also. I remember some of the kids bringing them to Central School when I went there, big bouquets of them for the teachers. And the Japanese people used to bring us their produce, onions and cauliflower and lettuce, and I think some strawberries too. And it was very open country then. Some of the blocks would maybe only have one or two houses, and the rest would be just open land. And there were paths through the, where if you were walking, you didn't have to go by the streets, because there were no sidewalks anyway. The streets had ditches at the edge, and no white line down the center of the roads. And there used to be quite bad fogs at times, and I remember being with my mom and dad and actually winding up in the ditch on the wrong side of the street in the fog because we couldn't see anything. There were very few street lights and not too many other cars, so there weren't very many accidents. There used to be floods too. Some of the people in the southern part of the city actually had to use boats to get around because the flood control channels were not put in until much later. Let's see. What else can I say? I can remember walking from Lawndale Central to South School. Our whole class would go down there to see plays and different things that they had down there. And I had two friends that I actually became close friends with when they were in 7th grade, because South School only went from kindergarten through 6th grade, and Central went all the way through the 8th grade. So the kids from South came to Central for the 7th and 8th grade. And that's how I met my two very close friends, Marie and Naoma, who are both passed away now. And we went all through losing her together also. It was a very different city than it is now. It was very, very open. And people didn't even lock their houses. You could buy a skeleton key in a dime store for 10 cents that actually would unlock any house in town if people did lock their doors, but no one had any electronic devices that people would steal. Because it was a different time and a different era than we live in now. And people used to raise chickens and have cows, and everyone had a vegetable garden, especially during the war. We called them victory gardens. And most people had flower gardens too. My mother did. She always loved to raise flowers. We had lots of animals here. We had cows, goats, pigs, chickens, turkeys, geese, rabbits, everything but horses. I don't recall horses, but they did have horses before I was born. And cats. I always had pet cats and dogs. And I think birds too. I think my mother had some parakeets. Is that enough now?